Welcome to Medicare Industry Insider. I'm Rachel Brandmeier.
And I'm Jalen Jackson.
And today we are going into, again, our three-part series over how the Medicare industry will look in a Trump-era administration. We're going to dive into three different branches and talk through what it means to be an insurance agent in the insurance industry and how all the branches are affecting what we do day to day. We are going to sprinkle a little bit of speculation, of course.
For sure.
Today, we're going to talk about the executive branch.
Absolutely. So not just the president himself under the second Trump administration. We got a little bit of a preview. Obviously, we've seen the first Trump administration and how some things shook out. But looking at the president and the government agencies that they appoint the leaders of and can help drive policy. So looking at what can the president actually do? That we talk all the time. They make all these campaign promises. Do they ever follow through on any of them? A lot of times a president may promise something that actually needs to be done by the legislature. So really what they're promising is maybe cooperation or working together. But there are a lot of things a president can do directly. One of the very first things we kind of expect, this is kind of the default anymore, is typically when a new president takes office, oftentimes on Inauguration Day, they'll sign an executive order placing a pause on any regulatory rules that were passed in the 90 days prior to inauguration. Biden did that when he took office. It's very likely Trump does that as well, to just put a pause on all rulemaking for the past 90 days until they can review those, edit those, make changes, throw a few out, add a few new ones, things like that. But those executive orders, like that one, are one of the biggest ways that presidents drive policy. They can oftentimes create certain things with an executive order, but more often than not, it's a directive. It's a call out to these federal agencies or even to Congress. For example, Biden's call out to lower prescription drug prices was an executive order a few years ago, which broadly resulted in things like the Inflation Reduction Act and a lot of the policy from the various agencies that we see now. Far-reaching implications, everything from how CMS has handled the Inflation Reduction Act to the Federal Trade Commission's pursuit of PBMs and the reports that they have done on how those work to increase drug prices. There is a lot of things that can happen just by that suggestion through an executive order.
So in addition to executive orders, they also have particular things that they can specifically appoint. So when you elect a president, they're then appointing heads of different federal agencies. So we're going to dive into some of those, not all of them, of course, but several federal agencies that are affecting our insurance industry.
Sure.
And what the ripple effect is usually with those. So one of the ones that I think everyone knows about is CMS, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. That head is appointed by the president. We'll see things like final rulings made, compliance changes are in the final rules, marketing updates of like basically how an agent can market themselves, how they get paid essentially. There's a lot of details that go into the final rule that comes out every single year.
Yep.
And a person who is appointed by the president. So depending on their beliefs and what direction they go can affect how that final rule plays out every year.
And this is another reason, when we elect a president, we oftentimes talk a lot about the first 100 days of a presidency. That's always a big bellwether moment, is what are you going to do in the first 100 days? What are those policy priorities? Now, the downside is when you have the Senate that is bogged down a little bit with approving all of these new agency heads, that can put a little bit of a damper on some of those legislative priorities. But with the GOP trifecta, with a Republican Senate, a Republican House, and a Republican in the White House, we are expecting a lot of these appointments to go relatively smooth. Obviously, we've already seen some of those. If you're watching this, we're recording it back in January, just a few days before the inauguration. So a lot of these approvals haven't even happened yet, but we're not necessarily anticipating a ton of issues. But let's jump into CMS. So HHS and CMS, obviously Trump's picks for those have garnered a lot of controversy, a lot of excitement by some entities in the industry. So RFK, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., to run Health and Human Services, and Dr. Mehmet Oz to run CMS.
Yeah, that'll be interesting. We're gonna go into a little speculation. I know you're jumping ahead a little bit, but it'll be interesting. We're gonna dive into that in this episode also. Some other federal agencies that we're gonna see are Federal Communication Commission, FCC. With that, it's gonna go into if you do operate any sort of call center or virtual agency doing anything over the phone, that's going to affect you. We'll see things like one-to-one consent, TCPA, the telemarketing sales rules, and the Telephone Consumer Protection Act. Those are all things that have come from that division.
Mm-hmm.
And we may see enforcement changes, things like that to that this year. But I can see with the trickle-down effect of more scrutiny, more oversight, you might see some additional regulations and things like that come from that side.
Very possible. So always up in the air, always speculative of what any particular agency head may do. I think we can probably argue that FCC, FTC, DOL may be a little less aggressive than they were under the Biden administration, or at least focus that aggressive questioning elsewhere. For example, we talked about on the judicial side, we expect things like drug pricing to continue to be big priorities, fraud, waste, and abuse in Medicare to continue to be big priorities. But for example, with the Federal Trade Commission, are there going to be quite as many, say, antitrust lawsuits brought against large corporations as they were under the Biden era? Maybe not.
Probably not. We'll see.
Absolutely.
Another one is Department of Labor. That is another appointed Fed from the executive order. So the president wouldn't appoint that person. That's going to affect things if you are an agency owner, like pay, benefits, overtime, any changes like that is coming from that particular department. So since Trump is a pro-business person, hopefully this is going to be a good thing as an agency owner with those appointments on that.
Yep. So, and we also see a lot of rulemaking out of the Department of Labor on certain standards for financial advisors or even insurance agents. For example, the Reg BI best interest rule that was passed under the Biden administration that requires some additional documentation and reporting for things like the sale of annuities or certain securities, making sure that those are in the best interests of a consumer. Definitely the kind of things that we would expect to see out of a Department of Labor. Now, again, there could be some work to repeal some of those rules. There could be some amendments to rules like Reg BI under the new administration. We really don't know what to expect just yet, but expect some change for sure.
We talked about this a little bit, but Department of Justice is also appointed by the president. That particular side is where we see like the price transparency and the drug.
Yep.
Transparency. So I don't see that going away in the Trump era. I think that it will continue to be something that they dig into of just more transparency.
Yep. Yeah. So, I mean, Trump historically has talked a lot about the most favored nation pricing and some of the other things that they would like to do to lower those drug costs. So potentially seeing the DOJ pursue action against whether it's manufacturers themselves, whether it's pharmacy benefit managers, someone within there, the 340B program, the discount program for hospitals and low-income individuals has been.
We have an episode of that too.
We sure do.
We need to go back and watch.
So that has been a huge topic of discussion the past few years. So I would expect some potential action on that either legislatively or through some of these government agencies, and DOJ may very well have to get involved. But we've also got organizations like the Federal Drug Administration, Food and Drug Administration, FDA, that we're expecting to see a lot of potential movement from. If you look at kind of the general trends from some of the big more conservative policy shops like Paragon, some of the others, you see a big trend where people are really kind of diving into this like medicine as food idea, this idea that, chronic illness is one of the most expensive and important issues facing our country from a healthcare standpoint. So looking at the FDA, HHS, you may start to see a bigger shift in, nutrition guidance, or even, I've argued that, we might see the Farm Bill, which is up for expiration in September, I believe. That may be one of the biggest pieces of healthcare policy that we see this year, since so much of it deals with things like SNAP benefits and WIC benefits and other food assistance programs. Changes to what types of foods are eligible to be purchased with those benefits, changes to how those benefits are administered, could be a significant part of the health policy initiatives under the Trump administration as well.
Very good points. So basically, to wrap it up in a nice bow, the president does appoint heads of federal agencies, and it kind of has a ripple effect and a trickle-down effect to agents and agencies, because you're going to see policy priorities being kind of pushed onto those appointments that the president has, but also regulations that we live by as agents are created by these agencies. So we mentioned like the final rules that affects so many things that we do day to day. It's going to affect commissions, affect marketing, it'll affect compliance regulations and what you have to do certification wise, things like that. So we're going to see a lot of because of who the president picks, potential changes that then trickle down to our industry.
Yep, absolutely.
So now we get to speculate some more. This is the fun part.
Yeah. So I think one of the big things we can talk about is just what are some of these potential impacts. Now, that doesn't mean any of this is actually going to happen, but just looking at, again, some of these policy shops, some of these influential people or groups that have put forth ideas that, GOP senators or congressmen or the president or the agencies may latch onto and try to implement. You've got things like Project 2025, which spent a lot of time in the news over the past couple of years with their 500 plus pages on HHS, including Medicaid and Medicare. So, general trend with most of those proposals are a very pro-business, a very small government solution to a lot of the issues they see in the marketplace, removing the prohibitions against doctor-owned hospitals, removing, changes with compensation with MA and private plans. Now, that doesn't mean there's no skepticism. I think it's really safe and fair to say that both within the legislature and even in the executive branch, there's a lot of support for the Medicare Advantage program, but there's also a lot of skepticism of, are we getting as good a deal as we think there are? The budget hawks, the deficit hawks are really looking at, the level of potential fraud, waste, and abuse in the Medicare Advantage program, the level of how much kind of gaming the system is going on with risk adjustment payments and things like that. So I think it's absolutely safe to say that we're going to see kind of an awkward situation where you've got a lot of people that are pro Medicare Advantage, but they're also pro getting their money's worth. And that's going to be a really tough thing to manage.
I think you said it perfectly. Pro Medicare Advantage, but pro managing their money also. Yep, because
absolutely.
That's been, I think, everything that when we were doing a lot of research and show notes, it was this very conflicting thing. It's kind of more uncertain because everyone that is getting put in positions are very pro Medicare Advantage. However, there's been a lot of situations where we've seen, lawsuits involving everything from claims to fraud, waste, and abuse to making sure that things are just running well. The other thing that we're going to potentially see is Medicaid changes. While this wasn't a huge thing, Medicaid wasn't brought up as a huge thing when Trump was being elected. We can do a lot of speculation from his first term. But we will probably see a little bit of uncertainty in terms of Medicaid. What this involves could potentially be maybe making it a little bit more difficult to qualify for Medicaid. We can see a little bit of talkings about work regulations and work requirements for it. We might see rate transparency and accountability. So they might look a little bit more into are the right people utilizing it? Are they making the right amount of money? It kind of goes back to that fraud, waste, and abuse thing that we talked about. A lot more scrutiny in terms of making sure that it's being used. We can also potentially see formerly known as food stamps, but Medicaid and the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program maybe being a little bit difficult to qualify for. All of that goes back into cost savings with this program and looking into making sure the right people are utilizing it. So again, all speculation, but there's been a lot of since we had that first term, we can kind of look a little bit deeper into that.
Yeah, and with tax cuts being such a huge priority for the second Trump administration, that money's got to come from somewhere. So limiting some of these entitlement programs is a common GOP tactic. But you've also got such narrow margins, and we'll talk more about this in the legislative one. I'm getting ahead of myself, but such narrow margins in the House and the Senate, and with midterms coming up in just 2 short years, how incentivized are those Congress folks going to be to Congress folks? That's a heck of a word.
Congress folks.
Congressmen and representatives, how are they going to be incentivized to maybe take some of those strong actions? And that really goes right into the ACA. There's it seems like something like repeal and replace is pretty much off the table.
Yeah, it's not going away.
No one's really talking about replacing the ACA anymore, but some changes to those subsidies, those tax credits, changing, things about compliance with ACA. We obviously saw the 2026 payment parameters come out back in January, and some changes to that ACA compliance and what CMS is looking for from agents. But, looking at the policy reform from a standpoint of subsidies, again, same thing. You've got a lot of legislators where if you look at the top 10 states by percentage growth in the ACA during the last open enrollment period, like 9 out of those 10 states were heavily GOP-centered states, heavily Republican red states, conservative states. So when those states where you've got a majority of consumers actively choosing on-exchange plans above some of the other states in the country, it's really tough as a legislator to look at that and go, maybe I ought to cut back on those subsidies for plans that my consumers, my constituents want. So again, ACA is going to be a tough row to hoe for some of these Congress folks that...
What'd you just say?
Tough row to hoe?
Row to hoe. Doing farming analogies, I love it.
Yeah. But it's going to be tough for some of these legislators to find a way to balance the budget, pay for these tax cuts while making sure that their constituents feel taken care of. Speaking of which, preventative services, another huge talking point on the ACA, as we've seen some of this kind of preventative services creep, where more and more things must be covered with no cost sharing under ACA plans. There's a lot of speculation that we may see some backtracking on that, some taking away of some of these covered items to help cut costs on the ACA and at the end of the day, reduce premiums.
I think it's all going to be cost cutting, making it more effective and efficient. So I think that's what we're probably going to see a lot of trends.
For sure.
So speaking of that, it's actually the next bullet point that we wanted to go over is cost cutting. One of the big things we're going to see is drug pricing. So Trump actually, and this goes back to his first term, he pioneered the price transparency and medical costs during his first term. So we're probably going to see another focus of energy in terms of not only in the ACA, but also on the Medicare side, just looking at prescription drugs, making sure we're lowering those costs. So it'll be an interesting thing to see what is a ripple effect. Again, we have, the Inflation Reduction Act that's already kind of doing some of that, but also what additional things would he continue to work towards, since that was something in his first term that he was looking at.
Yep. And I think, if you're someone who's politically active, wants to get involved, this is an area where there needs to be a lot of education for legislators, for folks involved in this, because I think, a lot of us see the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, as, if not a failure, then at least a deeply misguided effort to lower costs, and when really it did a lot of cost shifting.
It did.
And I think that is a dangerous road to continue to go down, but it's going to be tempting because it's an easy road to continue to go down. So rather than, potentially building on the Inflation Reduction Act, which I think would be seen very appealing, even under the second Trump administration, with things like most favored nation pricing that we've mentioned before, and some of these other price transparency and price reduction techniques. I think we really need to look at the base level impact that some of the existing policy has had, and make sure that we're not just adding fuel to the dumpster fire. We're making sure that we set that aside and find a new way to drive price competitiveness that is not just shifting the dollars around and hiding them.
Yeah. it'll be interesting to see all that. And we're also going to see a huge shift in deregulating a lot of things in terms of cost cutting too. So we might see it was already mentioned too with Vice President Vance of fixing healthcare. So we might see internal messages basically from, and this is another kind of funny thing, the Department of Government Efficiency, which is not
an actual government entity, but likely to function as another policy shop, another advisory group. There's the possibility that it might become an actual, commissioned committee to provide, information to the government. But most likely that the Doge, the Department of Government Efficiency,
that's why we laugh, because it's Doge.
Yeah, most likely this organization led by Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy is most likely to just provide policy suggestions. So definitely something that could be really effective at getting those suggestions to the forefront, knowing that they at least seemingly have the ear of the president, the ear of the administration. So definitely something to, I know a lot of folks are talking about lobbying more directly to the Department of Government Efficiency than even some legislators, because they think it's a good place to.
They have the ear of the government or the president, and certainly the goal is to cut spending and reduce regulatory burdens, and us making sure that things are working efficiently. So, hence the name efficiency in the Doge.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it'll be interesting to see that. So the next thing, and you hinted on this a little bit earlier, but Dr. Oz was the CMS appointed person from Trump for Medicare. So, looking through Dr. Oz's stances on things, that's where we can kind of predict a little bit of changes to CMS, or maybe policy shifting, or even just focus during Trump presidency. But one of the big things that Dr. Oz is pro Medicare Advantage, where we kind of talked initially in the beginning of this episode about the concerns about pro Medicare Advantage, but also scrutiny on oversight. So we might see some sort of give and take regarding that. Dr. Oz is also very pro-business, so that may be in more favor towards the insurance carriers.
Very well could be. And, what we're expecting to see maybe some changes from things that Dr. Oz has said in the past. During his Senate run in Pennsylvania, he said, Medicare Advantage for all, the idea of this, federally regulated but private insurance option for folks. He seems to have backtracked from that just a little bit. But again, still expecting to see some pro-MA sentiment there, pro-business. Lots of kind of concern in the media over his financial ties to a lot of healthcare companies. Some of it is pretty common things like owning a large amount of stock in several health insurance companies, but also owning a large stake in privately held companies that may or may not interact with the federal government. So at the time of recording this, there's still a lot of speculation over what kind of divestments or firewalls might be put in place to avoid those conflicts of interest. But I think the biggest thing we can expect as far as changes, in something that is already a changing landscape, star ratings are going to continue to be a huge driving force behind how Medicare Advantage functions. Now, one of the things that we expect to potentially see is a lot of focus on outcomes rather than technical compliance, because a lot of the measures for star ratings right now are very cookie cutter. Are you hitting certain metrics? Are you hitting certain numbers? Whereas they may in the future go towards more of an outcome-based star rating, where you're looking at, are you actually improving the health of your members, maintaining or improving the health of your members? Definitely a lot harder to measure in some instances.
For sure.
But definitely pushes forward the general goal of CMS. And that's something big to talk about too. Right now, the stated goal of CMS is to have 100% of Medicare beneficiaries engaged in some form of value-based care by 2030. That is now going to fall to the Trump administration to either continue and meet that goal, or to totally shift gears and realign with a more traditional approach to traditional Medicare.
I also see a lot more oversight of just with the idea of more efficiencies, looking into what kind of oversight, because obviously you're looking at governments a government who's very pro-business, wanting insurance carriers to succeed, but also be efficient, effective, ethical. And I think that has been a huge thing in the news recently too, just like making sure that claims are being paid, that things are being processed, that with the overall goal of people being healthy and taken care of. So I think there's just going to be this very big give and take that we're going to see as we go through this next era, the Trump era. So with that, I appreciate everyone for watching this part of our 3-part series, this one going specifically over the executive side. We like to speculate a little bit.
Yeah.
Educated speculation. But I hope you found this informational and that you can kind of then see what does the future of our industry look like and plan for the future. What does that look like in your own agency? What does that look like? How you talk to your clients? What information you come to your networking partners with in terms of pharmacies that you may network with, doctors' offices, other industry leaders, and even like you mentioned, being involved in government and educating senators,
Sure.
legislative individuals as well, just making sure that we are on the right path, there is value to us, and that we have a say.
Absolutely. Watch us again next time. We're going to go into the legislative side of Trump 2 administration and talk a little bit about what we may see in Congress over the next few years and what we may not see. But until next time, we'll leave you with this episode of Medicare Industry Insider.